When we first started coming to church here at Hillview, Pastor Barbara stopped by our house to talk to us a little bit, to hear our stories. And my story is a little unusual, a little different. Over sometime 20 years ago, I went to seminary and actually was a United Methodist pastor for 4 years, for those of you who didn't know that. And then left the ministry and came to Idaho and got into business. And so as soon as Pastor Barbara heard this story, she said, well, that's a good thing to know. We'll use that sometime. So here I am this morning, putting together some of what she wanted me to talk about this morning in terms of kicking off this sermon series on parables, and thinking back to way back then when I was in seminary and my preaching professor, he started class on our very first day in preaching class. He started with a cartoon that was, he called the 2 cardinal sins of preaching a sermon. And here's the cartoon. To make up for last week's 26-point sermon, this morning's message will be pointless. Those are the 2 cardinal sins. The first one is to stand up front and drone on and on and on. And on my 5th point that I'd like to make this morning, and the 6th point, that way nobody's going to remember anything, are they? The second cardinal sin is to start talking and droning on and on without any point at all, just to fill 20 minutes to have a sermon for everyone to listen to. But that's the beauty of a story, and that's why Jesus taught in parables. Because when you hear a story, you can think pretty quickly, well, there's a moral to that story, and you know what the point is. But as you remember the story and think through it more and more often through your life, you understand there's a lot of meaning in stories. Even a simple story can have a lot of complex meaning that means different things to different people at different... Yeah? Emily?
You're kind of droning on a little bit.
You think I'm droning on? You think I'm trying to make too many points here?
I can't decide if it's 26 points or pointless, but it's going on a ways.
Well, I just wanted to say what, Barbara wanted me to...
Well, you're talking about stories. Why don't you just tell us the story?
Well, that's a good idea. I didn't come with a story
I have
today.
a really good one, actually.
Oh, really? You have a story?
Can I tell you the story?
Sure. Why don't you tell us the story?
This story is called The Peach Seed Monkey, and it's by Sam Keene. Once upon a time, when there were still Indians, gypsies, bears, and bad men in the woods of Tennessee where I played, and more important still, there was no death, a promise was made to me. One endless summer afternoon, my father sat in the eternal shade of a peach tree, carving on a seed he had picked up. With increasing excitement and covetousness, I watched while, using a skill common to all omnipotent creatures, he fashioned a small monkey out of the seed. All of my vagrant wishes and desires disciplined themselves and came to focus on that peach seed monkey. If only I could have it. I would possess a treasure which could not be matched in the whole cosmopolitan town of Maryville. What status, what identity I would achieve by owning such a curio. Finally, I marshaled my nerve and asked if I might have the monkey when it was finished on the 6th day of creation. My father replied, "This one is for your mother, but I will carve you one someday." Days passed, then weeks, and finally years, and the someday on which I was to receive the monkey did not arrive. In truth, I forgot all about the peach seed monkey. Life and ambiance of my father was exciting, secure, and colorful. He did all of those things for his children a father can do, not the least of which was merely delighting in their existence. One of the lasting tokens I retained of the measure of his dignity and courage was the manner in which, with emphysema sapping his energy and eroding his future, he continued to wonder, to struggle, and to grow. In the pure air and dry heat of an Arizona afternoon on the summer before the death of God, I listened as he wrestled with the task of taking the measure of his success and failure in life. There came a moment of silence that cried out of testimony. Suddenly, I remembered the peach seed monkey, and I heard the right words coming from myself to fill the silence. In all that is important, you have never failed me. With one exception, you kept the promises you made to me. You never carved me, that peach seed monkey. Not long after this conversation, I received a small package in the mail. In it was a peach seed monkey and a note which said, "Here is the monkey I promised you. You will notice that I broke one leg and had to repair it with glue. I am sorry I didn't have time to carve a perfect one. 2 weeks later, my father died. He died only at the end of his life. Here ends the New Testament.
So the story of the peach seed monkey is an interesting story. It's another one of the things after that funny cartoon that we saw earlier. The peach seed monkey was the next story that just popped into my mind today to think about stories and about how we learn from stories. Because it's interesting how we see God in that story of the peach seed monkey. Who is God in the story? There's lots of different options when we look at it to think about how do we see God in that story. On the one hand, God could be just acting behind the wings. God's up in the clouds and has brought these two people together. Here's a father and a son, right? And the father has reached the end of his life, and he's reflecting on the things that have gone on in his life, and he needs an opportunity to be able to talk with the son. And here, somehow, by the grace of God, they've got that opportunity to sit down and talk. And the son's able to express his love and his gratitude to his father, and the father's able to share his love with the son. God's active in the love between the two people. But the way the story talks about God, well, the way the story talks about the Father is almost as though the Son thinks of the Father as God. And that's really understandable because we see in the Father a very loving Father, a very patient man, a Father who can do things with his hands, who can create the little peach seed monkey seemingly out of nothing, a Father who is concerned for his children. And isn't that the true model of God? Isn't that an image of God that we should all carry with us? So the second model of God is that God in this story is the Father who loves the Son. But one of the aspects of God in the story that I am coming more and more to see in this story as I get older and as my children grow up is that as a father looking at your children, you can see the face of God in them sometimes too. And for that father who is there at the end of his life, he's taking up this accounting of his life. Somehow it seems like he's searching as he's talking with his son. Was what I did good enough? Is there something that I did that I need to seek forgiveness for? How can I understand what I've been through and where I'm headed now at the end of my life? And there, by the grace of God, is the son who knows exactly the right thing to say. He doesn't give his father just a hollow, "Don't worry, Dad, you did a great job. Everyone likes you." He says, you did do a good job. You were a loving father. But honestly, there was something that you left out. There's something you forgot. And that's that peach seed monkey you promised me so many years ago sitting under the tree. And over the weeks, the father has the time then to carve another little peach seed monkey and sends it to his son. And it's a final act of love and generosity, of creativity. And we can imagine the father sitting there carving the monkey, being able to put his own life into that little figurine that he makes. And he was able to see through that the face of God in the Son that God provided for him. So here's a simple little story about a father and a son, and yet there's three different pictures of God. God is the love between the two men. God is the Father who's loving and creative. God is the Son who's nurturing and loving and accepting. That brings us this morning to our gospel lesson today, which is a very familiar story. It is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so I'll have Emily come forward for our gospel lesson this morning.
Yeah, so we're talking about the Good Samaritan, and I don't really understand how that connects with the peach seed monkey. I mean, the Good Samaritan's a simple story too, but it's just, we're supposed to love our neighbor and help him out of the ditch, right?
Sounds like it's pretty easy, right? Everybody has heard the Good Samaritan story before, right? I mean, even the kids who have gone out, I hope, have heard the story of the Good Samaritan. And we've heard it so many times, we know what it means. It means we need to be good to other people, right? That's all the story says. It's got one moral. But the interesting thing about the Good Samaritan is that there's actually 4 important people in that story.
Right. There's the lawyer in the beginning who, I guess, initiates the conversation with Jesus and asks, "Who is my neighbor?"
Yeah, so when Emily reads the story in a minute, we're going to hear it starts with Jesus talking to a lawyer. And the lawyer kind of challenges Jesus and says, "Who's my neighbor?" And so Jesus begins the story at that point. And he says, "So a man went from Jerusalem down to Jericho." Now, at the time, being a lawyer was a pretty high status in Israel. And here was an educated person, here was a rich kind of person, somebody who had status, somebody who would know the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Jericho was a center of trade, it was a large city. Jerusalem obviously was even a larger city, was the capital of the country. So for the lawyer, he understands what it would be to be a man going from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And the lawyer hearing the story says, well, that's kind of like me. I've been on that road before. I hope this guy going on the road watches out for bandits because it can be dangerous on that road. And that's exactly where we turn in the story. The story kind of takes a twist, and there the person ends up on the side of the road, and we encounter the second person in the story.
Who's the priest, right? And he just walks past the man and doesn't help him out of the ditch.
Right. So the priest, that kind of in today's world is pretty easy to understand. Priest would be like the pastor, Pastor Barbara, or maybe me today, standing up giving the sermon today. That's a priest. The third person
is the Levite, and he does the same thing as the priest, right? He just keeps walking.
The Levite walks around by too. So in Israel, a Levite is kind of an assistant to a priest. The Levites were keepers of the law, and so they descended from the tribe of Levi. You can think of, in the Old Testament, the first 3 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Leviticus comes from the same word as Levi. And we often will hear stories out of Genesis, the creation of the world and the first faithful people. And then we hear stories out of Exodus, which is where the slaves were freed from Egypt and came to start their own life in Israel. But we don't read very much out of Leviticus because Leviticus is, quite frankly, boring. It is law. You shall do this and do that and do this. And on these days you do this and do that and do this. So the Levites were the keepers of the law. Here is another person that the lawyer could really relate to. He was somewhere, probably not a priest, but somewhere close to being a Levite. And then finally, here in the story comes the fourth person,
which is the Samaritan, right? And he's the one who finally helps the man out of the ditch.
Finally, the Samaritan comes and does the good deed and helps the person who's in the ditch. But Samaritans are interesting people too. Samaritans were related to the Jewish faith. They thought that they were carrying on the true Jewish faith at the time. But for all the other Jewish people, for the priests and the Levites and even this lawyer that Jesus is talking to, the Samaritans were somebody very different. They wore funny clothes. They ate different food. They spoke in a different dialect. They even smelled funny. They were just weird kind of people. And yet here he's the one who does the good deed.
So in my head when I'm thinking about this story, I kind of am picturing a businessman, I don't know, just a regular Joe kind of person walking and who ultimately ends up in the ditch. And then I guess in my mind, Pastor Barbara walks by, although that doesn't really make sense that she wouldn't help him. But Pastor Barbara walks by, and then maybe Maggie walks by, or I guess today that'd be you and me. And then all of a sudden, the man is still in the ditch, and then here comes this other man who's from the North End, and he actually shops at the Hyde Park Street Fair. And that's kind of what I'm picturing. Is that reasonable?
That's probably not a bad picture. The Samaritan maybe had something like tie-dye clothes on, long dreadlocks, bare feet. He looked a little bit. He wouldn't fit in here today in our church. But another way to think of how the Samaritan, or who the Samaritan is it could be just someone from a different church. We all are pretty comfortable and familiar with each other. We know each other. We see familiar faces here. But there are people in other churches who might seem a little different to us this morning. There are people in other faiths who worship on different days of the week. The Samaritan could be like to us like a Jewish person going to synagogue, or it could be like a Muslim person who wears robes and takes their shoes off and kneels down to say their prayers when they go to their church. So the Samaritan is somebody really different that the lawyer just can't get his head around, can't understand how this person who's so much different from me is going to help me when I'm the person in the ditch. Why don't you read the story for us so we can hear?
Okay, the story comes from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbors as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I get back, I will repay you whatever you have spent.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise."
Jesus, in his parables, has a great way of making a point. And I love how the story starts with the lawyer saying, "Who's my neighbor?" And Jesus tells the story, and then at the end of the story he says, "Who's your neighbor?" And he lets the lawyer answer the question, "Who is my neighbor?" The funny thing about the parable of the Good Samaritan, or as I like to call it, the parable of the person in the ditch, is that the way we tend to have it interpreted for us is that we think, well, if a Samaritan is a person who's different than us and they're in need, we need to help that person out. But we listen to the story and we hear, it's not us helping the Samaritan, it's us being open to the help that the Samaritan has to give us. If we would turn the story around in the way that I usually think of it, it would be like the lawyer saying, well, so I'm the one going from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and I've been attacked and beaten, and I'm laying on the side of the road in the ditch, and here comes a Samaritan who needs my good help, who needs the gifts of God that I have, that I can give to him, so I'll jump up out of the ditch and help the Samaritan. But that's not the way it happens at all. The lawyer's the one laying in the ditch. He's the one who is in need. And so when we come to this parable, it's hard for us to get our heads around this, but we need to remember and think that we are the ones who are in need. And it's something that we experience at different times of our lives as we live our lives. It's something that we experience in different ways in our lives. That there are often times when we are the poor or the hungry or the sick. And it's something that we learn in the United Methodist Church. It's something I like to call Wesleyan guilt. That we always, even if we are poor or sick or hungry or in need, we need to be the ones who are helping other people. That's what we do. John Wesley was really good at teaching people that Scripture and prayer and studying with other people is always important. But he also said you need to spend a good deal of your time helping the poor and the sick and visiting people who are in prison. And so as good United Methodists, we think, well, I don't have time right now to be sick and to lay down and let somebody else serve me. I need to be up there doing that. And it's fun seeing the scouts here today because I know you guys probably struggle with that too, right? You guys know we're here to do good deeds. We always have to be ready, be prepared. And it's hard when you're ready and prepared to step back and say, maybe I can open myself up to God because I'm in need of the help of God. And when we can look around like the two people in the peach seed monkey and think, well, is God in the air between us? We kind of miss part of the point of the story too. But when we acknowledge our need and allow those around us to help us, then our eyes are open to see that they actually are the bearers of God's grace to us. It's their faces and their help, their assistance, that is the help, the assistance, the face of God in our lives. I don't know exactly how to put this whole story together, but in the tradition of stories, I hope that you'll go out of here thinking, how else can I interpret the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the person in the ditch? How else can I be open in my need to the work of others in my life? How can I be a sign of grace to them by allowing people to help me? And when you do that this week, I hope, like me, you'll try and think about, how is that person the presence of God in my life? This person who seems different than me, who normally I would really be happy to help them. How can I let them help me and let them bring God's presence into my life and into our world? Amen.